see here. Hello, everyone on Zoom. We're just seeing what was going on with the live stream. I think we got it now. Hold on. I hope we got it now. Just need to reshare it. Yeah, there we go. Okay. We're working now. So allow me to share it on our pages, and then we'll get going for tonight. Technology's great until it doesn't work. Technology's great until it doesn't work. All right, there we go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight as we continue in our third week of apologetics with Pastor Nick Mitchell. And just so we understand how we got here, 1 Peter 3:15 says, "Sanctify the Lord Jesus in your hearts, always ready to give a defense for the faith that's in you." So that's why we're doing this, right? So that we will be able to give a defense on what it is that we believe, why we believe what we believe, how do we defend our faith in a practical and tangible way without always saying, well, the Bible says, but really being able to stand in society and even looking at how they look to tear down the existence of Christ. They look to tear down the moral standard. They look to tear down what we believe through Adam and Eve, through evolution. So how do we defend that? How do we stand on that? So that's where we are. And that's why we've been here for the past 3 weeks. So we're grateful to have Pastor Nick back again. And we're just going to go in tonight. I believe we're going to deal with the cosmological argument and one other argument tonight, and that will wrap us up. So I'm going to get out the way, and I'll chime in, and here we go.
Well, hello, everyone. So the first week we talked about Jesus, and we talked about him being a real person, and we went through, how to defend that. We went through his claims, at least one of his claims that he claimed to be the Son of God, and how that impacts the way you define who he is. Week number 2, we looked at the problem of evil. We looked at suffering, and we dealt with some difficult questions. And today we're in just a little bit of a different place where we're looking at how to evidence God. Is there really any evidence for the existence of God out there? Or is it just 100% belief? So these arguments don't point directly to Jesus. They can be used by Muslims. It points to that there's something there. And really, the arguments kind of funnel down to the point of Jesus. So it's a little different. And this first argument was one of my favorites when I first got into apologetics. I really like this argument. But I thought tonight we might talk about 3 arguments if we have time. One, the cosmological argument, which is how the universe, impacts the idea of what we believe. 2, the fine-tuning argument, like if God did have something to do with the universe, then maybe his fingerprints are on it. And we'll kind of look at that. And then 3, I thought we'd talk about the resurrection of Jesus a little bit, only because Paul says everything hangs on that.
Right.
And as we know, it's really the only religion that's falsifiable. If the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is false. So let's just take a look at some things. Now, I want to say from the beginning that I'm not going to be exhaustive in the content here because we're dealing with it in a very narrow time space, and you could go on with these for a long time. But you can get on YouTube, you can type this in, and you can educate yourself. And it's kind of like what I did. And you'll find, no loss of content out there. So
Is there a particular person they should look for? Because I'm sure if they put it in, they're gonna get a myriad of different people who are teaching on this.
well, yeah, I mean, one of my favorite apologists is from reasonablefaith.org, and that is Dr. William Lane Craig. And he's definitely the guy that first got me started on apologetics when I listened to him. Another person who really impacted me was Dr. Frank Turek of crossexamine.org. And there's a lot of others, but those particular two guys pretty much could get you grounded in apologetics.
Okay.
In their website.
So Frank Turek and William.
Yeah, Dr. William Lane Craig and Dr. Frank Turek of crossexamined.org. Dr. Craig is from reasonablefaith.org. Dr. Craig has debated all over the world and in the highest academic forums and the most prominent atheists in the world. And if you look up his debates, you really get a good idea. He uses the same 5 arguments over and over again. It's really a great way to get started. But you have to listen to these debates, and that takes some time, and not everybody can do that. All right, let's get started. So we're going to get started with the first one, which is called the cosmological argument. And what is a cosmological argument? So it's a type of argument for the existence of God that starts with the existence of the universe.
Cosmos.
The cosmos.
The cosmos.
Cosmological cosmos, right. And it asks, why is there something rather than nothing? I mean, think about it. Why is there something rather than nothing? And it argues that the universe needs a cause or an explanation outside of itself. In other words, if the universe exists, then it must have come from somewhere or something. So what caused it? That's really what it is. So cosmological arguments are rooted in logic and observation. And they generally conclude that the best explanation for the universe's existence is God. So it's moving towards the best explanation. And there are several types, but they all revolve around the need for a first cause, something that didn't need to be caused by anything else. So we're going to get started tonight with what's called the Kalam cosmological argument. This was made popular by Dr. William Lane Craig, and if you want to hear the full version, go right to his website and you'll hear it. But it starts off like this. There's 2 premises and a conclusion. And the first premise is this, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. I'll say it again. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The second premise is that the universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Let me say it one more time. Whatever began or whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So let's talk about the viability or the plausibility of these premises. So whatever begins to exist has a cause. All right. It's not just a philosophical claim. It's a principle that we all know in our human experience. We know it in science. We know it in reason. That it's sort of like a philosophical intuition that and what would be called even a self-evident truth, that, things don't just pop into existence. They don't, from nothing or for no reason. They just don't, things don't just pop into existence. Why? Because nothing has no properties. It can't produce anything. Aristotle said that nothing is what rocks dream about. And if things could begin to exist without a cause, then anything and everything could randomly pop into existence. Like a piano could pop in over here, a polar bear or a planet could just pop into existence. And yet we don't see that happening.
One of the things that I've spoken to people about when talking about the cosmological arguments, I use something very tangible, which is, hey, what material is that shirt you're wearing? They say cotton. I say, okay, well, if I took a bale of cotton and dumped it in the middle of the road, if you left it there, would it turn into that shirt you have on? And they say, no. Well, it had to be created by someone or something. So that kind of simplifies the process of the cosmological argument, saying nothing, Nothing can come from nothing. It has to come from something.
So the idea that the cotton is there, yes,
Right.
but turning into
To
a
a
shirt,
shirt.
that's really the design argument.
Mm-hmm.
That's how that sort of moves from one thing to the other,
Right.
which we're going to get into. But think about this. In real life, we always look for causes. You look for the lightning strike. You look for, if there's a car accident, what caused it, medical symptoms. We ask what caused that.
Right.
And in science, every experiment is built on causal assumptions. So if we do X, then Y will happen. And if causality were not reliable, science would be impossible. It's built on that principle. Even skeptics who doubt the premise assume it in practice. They lock their doors at night because they assume like a cause, like an intruder, leads to an effect, like theft. And there's also scientific support for it. So causality is the foundation of the scientific method itself, right? Science is based on the idea that events follow laws and they follow causes. Scientists, they look for causes in disease. They look for galaxy formation. They look for genetic traits. They never stop at it, just happens. Think about if science was relegated to the first premise that everything that begins to exist has a cause. If they just wipe that out, then if you got sick with something, they wouldn't think there's a cause. It just popped into existence. Well, that person got cancer. Well, it just popped into existence. We know someone who came down with some symptoms. They went to the doctor and through the symptoms, they figured out it was a tick bite. Right. And they were able to treat causality.
Right.
So, the idea that the universe just popped into existence would be absurd based on everything that we understand. If someone says that the universe just popped into existence out of nothing, then really that would be absolutely absurd, and there would be no foundation for that.
So what are some simple causalities? Like, so if we're speaking to someone and we want to talk about a simple causality in, nature or just in the environment, what would be a simple type of causality to say, hey, this had to be created by someone or something outside of this particular environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. In my mind, I immediately divide that into two categories. What I would call agent causation and effectual causation, which is something that's either caused by a mind or something that's caused by a process.
Okay.
So if you saw, for example, a plant coming out of the ground, you know that somehow a seed got down there. And that's something that's caused not necessarily by a mind, although it could be, but like the computer here, this, if you took all these raw materials and you put them in a box, how many times would you have to shake it for it to turn into the computer? There's an agent causation here.
Okay.
So everything is contingent on something else. There's nothing that's not contingent. So when you look at anything, it came from something else. And it goes all the way back to the beginning of the universe. So everything is causal, has a causal property. There's nothing that you could name in this world that didn't come from something else. So if you're looking for something to show causality, you could quite literally use anything. Unless, as a matter of fact, I think the harder thing to ask would be, give me something that wasn't caused. Tell me anything in the universe that was not caused. Name one thing for me. You'll find that you wouldn't be able to. Everything is contingent on something else.
Okay.
All right, so the causal law, if you will, is in place. So the next part of the syllogism, and by the way, there are verses that kind of support this in the Bible, if you want to go through those real quick.
Yes.
Things don't come into being without a cause. Creation flows from a creator. Biblically, Hebrews 3:4 says that every house is built by someone, and the builder of all things is God. And that's really a causal statement. It points to the natural principle that design implies a designer, right? Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And really, the beginning of all things had a cause, God. Romans 1:20 says that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes have been seen clearly, being understood through what has been made, creation itself points to a cause beyond creation. So biblically, it's all there.
Right.
But let's go to premise two. Now, premise two is that the universe began to exist. So whatever began to exist has a cause. And now we're going to say that the universe began to exist. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I'm going to rely on some scientists for this, but both philosophical reasoning and scientific evidence strongly support this. Let's just walk through the logic and see how it leads us to the conclusion. So I might lose you here, not you, but maybe some of you that are talking, and I apologize up front, but this principle could be a little difficult, but it's something that you need to hear. And that is that the idea that the universe has always existed with no beginning runs into some big problems. And here's a few ways to understand why. Think about time itself. Now, the universe is made up of time, space, matter, and energy. So without the universe, there is no time. So think about this. If you had a line of dominoes, you know what dominoes are, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hope you know what dominoes are. Anyway, if you had a line of dominoes stretching back forever, would they ever fall? If you had an infinite past, if you had no beginning, think about it. If the universe was always here,
Mm-hmm.
and you had, and like a set of dominoes, you would, if it was infinite past, you could never get to this moment.
Right.
Because you can never get to the beginning, because there is
There's
no
no
beginning.
beginning.
You'd forever be going back. You would never get to the point where you could touch the first one and start the thing in motion. And yet we're here.
This is where the debate comes in with the scientists with the Big Bang Theory. They're trying to find out what happened immediately after what they perceive to be the universe coming into existence.
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting thought. The Big Bang Theory, which is really accepted, it's been tried for 100 years now, just about, and it's pretty much set as, truth at this point. Even though it's still called a theory, and it's always called a theory, it really states that at bottom that the universe, time, space, matter, and energy popped into existence out of nothing about 13.8 billion years ago. And you could argue with the time, we could have, a debate all day long, and that's okay. Whatever it is that, if you believe that the earth is so many years old, or, whatever, you can. But what I think is interesting is that science has come to the conclusion that the universe came into existence from nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And now, from premise one, we know that you can't have something popping into existence out of nothing. There has to be a cause.
Right.
So once you establish that the universe came into existence, which science and cosmology firmly establishes, you got a big issue. So let's just talk about it for a minute. If the past has no starting point, if time stretches back, then we never arrive at today, right? All right, so let's take a calendar. What if someone told you they flipped through an infinite number of calendar pages before getting to today? It's impossible.
They would have never got here.
You can't finish flipping. Okay, so you get the point, right? So in the Big Bang Theory, we know that, and by the way, the Big Bang is not an explosion.
Mm-hmm.
When Fred Hoyle coined that, he was really talking about the expansion of the universe. What's happening is that there's nothing there, and then all of a sudden, the universe is expanding. And when I say expanding, I don't mean that the planets and the stars and things are moving through space and they're just getting bigger and bigger. I mean, space itself is expanding. I've heard the analogy, think about a muffin in the oven with raisins in it. And as the muffin expands, the raisins get further and further away, but they're not moving through the muffin. Space itself is expanding. And if the universe was eternal, then we would have already, think about this. There's nothing feeding the universe. It's a closed system. So whatever energy is in the universe,
That's all it is.
that's it.
That's it.
And it's running down the energy. Eventually, there's going to be a heat death if the universe is left long enough. There will be no more. Everything is going to come to sort of an equilibrium. And if we haven't reached that point yet, then there had to be a point when it was full and it's burning down, which tells us that it had a beginning. And eventually, like science says, if it, I think it's about 13 or 14 billion years from now, the universe is going to suffer a heat death. There'll be nothing left. It'll just be darkness. And that's pretty, to me, that's pretty interesting. So, and that's called the second law of thermodynamics. And you know, it's actually, it's like a flashlight with a battery. Eventually, it's just going to burn out. So, I think we can pretty much establish that the universe came into existence. If not, you would have to have a infinite regress, which we can't have, and you would also have to do away with the second law of thermodynamics, which you cannot do. And everything in science would point. We seem to be having. Wait, I thought someone was jumping in.
No.
Okay. So that leaves us to the conclusion, and the conclusion is that if we're saying that whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe has a cause, then the universe began to exist, and the universe has a cause. And that conclusion might seem simple on the surface, but when you unpack it, it points powerfully to the existence of God. And it's not just any God, but one with attributes that align remarkably well with the God of the Bible. Okay? And the logical force is that the universe has a cause, then the cause must be uncaused and eternal. It can't itself be something that was caused.
Right, was caused.
And the reason why it can't be something that was caused itself is because time didn't exist. And if time didn't exist, then whatever brought the universe into existence had to be eternal. Otherwise, time couldn't have come into existence.
So this ties into what you shared last week before last, the greatest conceivable being.
Yes.
Okay. Outside of time, space.
Yeah. And I just want to point something else out. And if you ask somebody what is the greatest conceivable being, they're going to start saying things like all powerful, all loving, all nature. But, you know, really that points to the compass in our heart, because why would that be the greatest conceivable being in your heart? Why would goodness be the greatest conceivable being? You're already showing the morality in your heart, that you see that standard up here and not down here. So it points to that progression. It actually shows you your own heart by even suggesting that.
Right.
But back to the cosmological argument. So the cause of time can't be inside of time. That would be absurd, right? So it has to be outside of time, timeless, eternal, and something can't cause itself, so the first cause has to be uncaused. Whatever brought the universe into existence has to be uncaused, or everything we know about physics is wrong. Everything we know about astronomy, what we see, cosmology, is wrong. Everything we know, the Big Bang Theory, is wrong. Everything we know is wrong. So it's a very powerful statement that whatever brought the universe into existence has to be uncaused. Secondly, it would really have to be immaterial, because the cause that created space and matter cannot itself be made of space and matter. Otherwise, it would already exist. Now, I know that sounds like a tongue twister, but you really have to think about it. Whatever it is, it's not made of space. It's not made of material, matter as we know it. And the cause has to be immaterial, non-physical, not bound by atoms or dimensions, what we know in the universe. It has to be powerful. To bring a universe and all the energy, matter, and the laws and everything into existence, it has to be the greatest act of power imaginable. What could be that powerful to do this? What can be uncaused, not made of space or material, matter, and then be that powerful to bring a universe into existence? And then I would say that it would have to be personal. And the reason I say, and it's really the most overlooked point, and that's because why did the cause create the universe when it did? If, remember, we talked about agent causation and effectual causation or non-agent causation, right? Why would the universe be at a certain point in time brought into existence? Why wouldn't it be earlier or later? If the cause were mechanical or impersonal, the effect, the universe, would have happened eternally without delay. And the cause itself couldn't have been in existence prior, if you could say, to that, the universe. It would have happened simultaneously. But we know the universe is, according to science, 13.8 billion years old. So that points to sort of like a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, personal, uncaused first cause of the universe. And these are precisely the attributes of God in classical theism. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And while it doesn't get us all the way to Jesus, it does bring us right to the doorstep of the Creator who chose to bring a world into existence. And any thoughts or questions so far?
Not about the not about the cosmological. I mean, we'll hold it for Zoom until afterwards.
Okay, so let me just say this. There's some ways that this argument evidences God, and I love this argument. This was one of the things that opened up my mind to the idea that there are evidences of God in the world. It's not just faith and belief in something. Although I have faith and belief, there are real evidences out there. There are good reasons to think that God exists.
Right.
And so number one, it points to a timeless and an eternal being. Number one. So, since time itself began with the universe, the cause has to be outside of time, right? Two, it requires a spaceless and an immaterial cause. Three, it demands a personal free will agent. Four is that it shows the cause must be all powerful. It has to be more powerful than anything in the universe. And there's some heavy duty power in the universe, but it really needs to be unlimited. And then also it affirms the contingency of the universe, which is that the universe didn't have to exist. It's not necessarily existing. Because it was brought into existence or came into existence, it wasn't there at some point. Therefore, it's not a necessary being. It's not necessary. It didn't have to exist. Therefore, it itself is dependent, just like everything inside the universe is dependent. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
So the cosmological argument doesn't just say something caused the universe. It tells us what kind of a cause. An eternal, immaterial, spaceless, powerful, personal, and necessary cause. Exactly how the scriptures describe God. And what I think is so amazing is that there is no other offering as to what brought the universe into existence. There's like no other. They try to put things like a multiverse, but that's just made up. There's no evidence for a multiverse. And even if you had a multiverse, which is like a bunch of universes, it just pushes the problem to the when did the first universe get created? Otherwise, you create an infinite regress, which we know can't happen.
Right.
So it doesn't really do anything, and that's just a made-up thing that's trying to avoid the implication. And that's why. And some people say, well, what about God? Who created God?
Right.
And you can't really say that because, like we said, whatever began to exist has a cause. That's the first premise.
Right.
And since he's outside of time, he would have to be uncaused.
Right.
So, and if he wasn't, then you could say, well, then what caused the God that caused that God, and so on and so forth. Who created the God that created the God who created the God? And you can create again an infinite regress.
And this is a good argument about being able, have to be uncaused to be God, especially when Scripture tells us to watch out for false prophets, watch out for false teachers, those who come and say, I am the Christ. You know, we've heard about people saying that they are the reincarnate of Christ. You know, Pastor Nick and I were laughing a couple years ago. There was a guy in Kenya, and he was telling everyone that he was Jesus Christ. And it was right around Resurrection Sunday, and they said, "Okay, we're going to kill you and see if you get up on the third day." And he ran. Uh, he ended up running to get help from the authorities. But when we think about it that way, that's a good qualifier when people come along to say, "I'm this," or "I'm God," or "I'm the Messiah," because there are people out there. I think we were talking a couple weeks ago about the guy who's doing that now. I can't remember his name now, but he's out there now. He's got a big following all over, and he's saying that he is God. And this is pretty scary stuff.
Yeah, there's always going to be people claiming to be God. It's amazing to me. You know, someone might even say about this argument, well, isn't this just the God of the gaps argument? Because we don't know what created the universe. But you're just sticking God in there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like a gap. And really, the Kalam argument is not about plugging God into ignorance. It's really a positive argument based on what we do know about philosophy and science. And we know the universe began to exist, and we know that things that begin to exist have causes. So really, we infer a cause with special attributes, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, personal. And really that's reasoning to the best explanation. And that's why we say God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe. And the reason why, and I got that from Dr. William Lane Craig, and it makes a lot of sense, because when you say God is the best explanation for the origin of the universe, and someone says, well, no, I don't think so, then they have to offer a better explanation. You know, what's your explanation for the origin of the universe? That takes into account all the science and everything.
Right.
So it's definitely not a God of the gaps argument. All right, so let's move on.
Okay.
And we're going to move on to what's called the fine-tuning argument. And this is an interesting argument. And if God created the universe, right, you're going to see his fingerprints in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you're going to see kind of like the markings in the universe of God. After all, he created it. Fair enough, right? So we're in what's called the Goldilocks zone. Just think about this. Have you ever noticed how everything in our world is just right for life? It's not too much, it's not too little. It's just like Goldilocks. But this isn't a fairy tale, it's reality, and this reality has a designer. And imagine walking into a room and finding a dozen dials on a control panel, 12 dials, and they're all set to the perfect number. Would you assume that it was random?
No.
That they just appeared there? Or would you ask, who set these dials? Mm-hmm. And, you know, let me bring it even closer to home. If you ever had a fish tank, or you know someone who's had a fish tank, to keep the fish alive, everything has to be carefully balanced.
Right.
Now, I've never had a fish. Deb had the fish. You know, cute story. We got a goldfish somewhere in a bag. And I figured it would last two days. This thing lasted for years. It was in a bowl, and a bigger bowl, and a bigger bowl, and it even knew Deb. Deb would call it would swim to the side of the cage. It was like an eternal goldfish. But everything has to be carefully balanced. The temperature has to be just right. The oxygen levels need to be maintained with a pump, right? The filter system, the charcoal, clean, the water has to be clean. The waste and the toxins have to be taken out. And even lighting, pH levels, plants, decorations, they all play a role. One imbalance and the fish die. Mm-hmm. And you ask anyone who has those big tanks with those beautiful fish, and they'll tell you it's not easy. It's a lot to keep that going.
And when you think about the fine tuning, I just want to kind of dovetail a cosmological argument into that, because even when you think about the universe, you think about the alignment of the planets, and how the Earth sits on its axis, and what is right behind Earth but Saturn with the ring, and things that come from outer space. It literally, Saturn creates this barrier, and it just projects the things that come from outer space away from hitting Earth. When you start looking at how it's all set up, how we are perfectly away from the sun. If we were a little bit closer, we would be incinerated. If we were too far away, we would be frozen. When you start looking at this, that's the fine tuning. So when you think about the cosmological argument, you can go from space and then drill down to our actual environment.
Right. So if the universe contains these constants and these conditions, that it has to fall within incredibly narrow ranges, right? For life to exist. It's the kind of precision that strongly suggests the work of an intelligent creator. Let me give you 8 of these examples. All right, one of them would be, God's fish tank, if I could say it like that. And the oxygen levels. The oxygen levels on Earth here are exactly at 21%. And how they stay at 21%, nobody knows. But if they go to 25%, we have spontaneous fire breaking out all over the world. If it goes to 15%, all life suffocates. How does it stay? We don't know. God just didn't give us breath. He gave us breathable air. The plate tectonics and earthquakes. Now, people hate earthquakes, and I get that. But these movements recycle carbon, and they regulate the Earth's temperature and enrich the soil. It's like a filter system in the fish tank, messy but essential. Even the shaking of the ground is a system of divine maintenance. Without earthquakes, we all die on the planet. They're necessary. As you were mentioning before, Pluto's position, right? I think Jupiter. I think Pluto. I don't even know if Pluto's still a planet. I think it's a dwarf planet now,
Right.
maybe gas. But Jupiter, this giant planet. You ever see Jupiter in comparison to Earth? Earth looks like this big, and Jupiter looks like this.
Right.
And its gravitational pull, it's just set somewhere farther back from us, and it acts like a vacuum cleaner for comets and asteroids. It sucks them all. If you look at the surface when they show of Jupiter, it looks like a 16-year-old with acne. That's how many holes and pockmarks are on it, which would all be coming our way if that giant planet wasn't just like stuck there. Carbon dioxide levels, right? Think about that. It's at 0.04%. Think of how finely tuned that is. We need that for plants, for climate regulation. Too much, if that goes up, we have global heating, right? Too little, plants can't survive. It's like chemical balance in the tank. Tiny amounts make a huge difference. God is very precise, even with parts per million. Think about the distance of the sun, 93 million miles away. A little closer, Earth gets burned up. A little farther, it freezes. Just like placing, the fish tank in the right room at the right temperature. Earth's gravity, strong enough to hold us in our atmosphere, yet gentle enough for us to move around. We couldn't move. Gravity is God's way of keeping our environment intact. Even the cosmological constant, what it's called, it governs how fast the universe expands. If it was just slightly faster, planets couldn't form. Nothing would form. The matter would just move away from itself. It would just be scattered all over the universe. If it was tighter than it is, it would pull everything back and the universe would collapse. So we really have a lot to be thankful. Even the moon, it stabilizes the Earth's tilt. And it gives us the tides, and it regulates life in the oceans. Without it, the Earth's climate would swing wildly. You wouldn't want to be on this planet. And it's like a gentle agitation, like you do in a fish tank, to keep the water moving, keep it in balance. So, do these things happen because of necessity? I mean, and there's a lot more of those. I'm giving you, the very simple ones, because again, I'm not a scientist. You could look it up. There's like 122 of these constants that have to be perfectly aligned. But how do we explain this? Did it all have to be this way? But the laws of physics don't require these settings. They could be different, but they're all dialed in. How? And they're dialed in from before we got here. It's all dialed in. Could it be chance where we just got lucky? I don't think so. Let me tell you how lucky we would have to be if it was luck that we just by chance got there. You guys have heard of the lottery?
Mm-hmm.
This thing? People scratch things and numbers, right? So, what would you think of a person that won the lottery once, and then twice, and then 3 times in a row, and then 4 times in a row, and then 5 times? What would you start to say to yourself?
They know something.
10 times in a row?
It's rigged.
20 times in a row? What would you say?
It's rigged.
Come on, you're from New York. What would you be saying?
It's rigged.
This thing is rigged.
Right.
Right? But what if you took all the atoms in the universe, every atom in the universe, in order, the probability of all of these things being fine-tuned the way they are would be equivalent to someone winning the Powerball in a row more times than the amount of atoms in the universe. That's how finely tuned. It's a number that can't even be written down. It's that small. It's virtually impossible. So we have to think to ourselves, it can't really happen by chance. It's not something that we can reasonably, say that. And we really, what fits is that it was planned. You know, everything we instinctively know, where there's order in life, there's a designer.
Mm-hmm.
The scriptures say in Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God. Isaiah 45:18 said, God did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited. Romans 1:20, his invisible qualities, eternal powers, divine nature have been clearly seen. Job 38, God asked Job, where were you when I laid the foundations? So the universe doesn't just show us that something happened. It shows us that someone intended it to happen. And the same God who balanced the atmosphere, positioned the moon, spun the stars into orbit, formed you, he knows you and loves you. Think about it. And you're not an accident in a random tank. You're the centerpiece of God's carefully designed creation. And that's really, sort of like an overview of the design argument or the teleological purpose argument.
Okay. So we got the cosmological, we got
Fine-tuning
the fine-tuning, and then our final argument is
We're going to look at the resurrection
resurrection.
of Christ, if that's okay.
Yep.
And how are we doing for time?
You got about 10 minutes.
Yeah, we're not going to be able to do this, but that's okay. So, I think that in Luke 24, and I'm going to bring in a scripture for this because they got to the tomb and they said, why do you seek the living among the dead? He's not here, but he is risen. It's almost like when you go to a funeral, why do you seek the living among the dead? If the person is with God, Jesus. The question that changes everything is, they found the tomb empty. These women found that tomb and it was empty. And, why do you seek the living among the dead? It's more than a question. It's a declaration, really, if you think about it. He's not here. He's risen. And this is what sets us apart from every other religion. Every other religion is kind of belief in something that's there. But like Paul said, this happened in physical reality. This person was in physical reality. And he was resurrected. And if the resurrected is false, your belief is false.
Right.
So he pointed to something that actually happened in reality as the basis of our faith in God. There is no other religion that does that. Every other religion is like something in the mind. Our religion is based in reality. Christianity stands alone. Okay? So that's why I think this argument is probably the most important. So the empty tomb. First, I want to give you some thoughts about it. Now you can look up the argument. There's so many different ways to look at this, but I want to give you some thoughts. Number one, the body was never produced. The tomb was found empty. This is in history. The woman went to the tomb. The Roman guards sealed the tomb. It was a massive stone. Yet on the third day, it was empty. If someone stole the body, where did they take it, and why didn't anyone say so? If Jesus never really died, how did he escape and walk around perfectly healed and convince everybody he had been risen? The authorities had every reason to shut this down, yet nobody did and nobody could explain it. Just think about that. The silence of Jesus' enemies speak louder than the loudest critics today. Secondly, the transformation of the disciples. From fear to fire. In John 20:19, they were hiding behind locked doors. They weren't heroes. They were terrified. Peter had denied him. Thomas doubted. Most of them had scattered. And yet, days later, they were boldly preaching, healing the sick, facing persecution, and rejoicing to suffer in his name. What happened in these few days? Something happened, something real. You don't die for a lie you made up. You don't endure torture for something you know you faked. unless you saw him alive again. Now remember, this isn't something they were taught. This is something they saw.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like somebody who gets into a plane and crashes into a building because of their ideology, because they believe somebody else. They weren't believing anybody else. They saw him. This is what they saw. Can you imagine a dying for this, something you saw? It sets them apart. How did the church explode? If there's no resurrection, tell me how the church exploded. Right where he was killed. In Acts 2, Peter preaches in Jerusalem. 3,000 people believe. This didn't happen far away. It happened in Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified. These people saw the trial. They saw the cross. They knew about the tomb. If this was a hoax, any eyewitness could have refuted it. But instead of dying out, the church was born in the hardest place to fake a resurrection. Christianity didn't grow because it was powerful. It grew because it was true. Thirdly, the silence of the opposition. Nothing could stop it. The religious leaders bribed the guards, we find, and to say that disciples stole the body in Matthew 28:11, we read this. But even their lies couldn't stop the truth. How come in all of antiquity? Now there's thousands of documents in the New Testament, which we know, and that's another story. But there's at least 5,700 or 800 Greek manuscripts from the New Testament alone, from all the way back to, within 100 years or so. How come there's not one ancient document that disproves the resurrection or says it didn't happen? How come there's no record of a court trial, no grave? There's no refutation. How could all of history be completely silent on that? I mean, just think about that. If the resurrection was a myth, the truth could have been exposed, but it wasn't, because it happened. The empty tomb had no rebuttal, because the tomb was empty. And what changed the heart of these followers? These were the unlikeliest witnesses. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and other women. In that culture, women weren't even considered reliable witnesses. And yet they were the first to see Jesus alive, and they told everyone. Saul, think about him, Paul, the chief persecutor. He became Paul. The greatest preacher, right? Mm-hmm. Who writes a fake story and puts women and enemies at the center? Who puts women as the testimony, and then Paul, the persecutor, as the guy who just brings Christianity all over the world? It does no one, unless it's true. The resurrection proves that salvation is ours. Romans 4:25, he was delivered over to death for our sins and was raised to life for our justification. The cross was the payment for our sin. The resurrection is the receipt. It's proof of payment. It's proof that payment went through. Did you ever pay someone you had to provide proof of payment? Mm-hmm. That's proof of payment. No resurrection equals no Savior. No resurrection equals no forgiveness. No resurrection equals no hope. Does that make sense? Any thoughts? So, why was the tomb empty? If there's no resurrection, why was the tomb empty? Why were the disciples transformed? Why didn't the authorities stop it? Why did the church grow in hostile territory? Why did the people rather die? Why did they die rather than deny? There's really only one explanation that makes sense, and that Jesus Christ is risen, and not metaphorically and not symbolically, but in reality, he rose from the dead. So, think about the response of the people in Jerusalem. I'm trying to get this out as fast as I can. I'm sorry. If I'm rushing, I so apologize for that. But I'm trying to get it done in the next 5 minutes. So, the response of the people in Jerusalem is a testimony to the resurrection. Acts 2:37 says they were cut to the heart. After Peter's sermon, his resurrection sermon, by the way, the people didn't laugh and scoff at him. They were pierced through the heart, it says, and they asked, "What shall we do?" That's a startling reaction, considering Peter accused them of crucifying the Messiah in Acts 2:36. This points to a deep conviction that they were hearing a truth, not a fantasy and not a delusion. He's telling them the man you crucified is raised from the dead. And they're saying, what do we do? How? Why didn't they say, well, you're crazy. He's not raised from the dead. He's gone. How did 3,000 people turn around and say that? It just doesn't make sense unless he rose from the dead. You know, they publicly aligned with Jesus. You know, about 3,000 people, right, added to the number that day. In a public city during a major festival, thousands were baptized, publicly identifying with a crucified and allegedly risen man.
All from different places, devout men.
Yeah.
From different parts,
Yes.
from all over.
Yeah. They weren't joining the popular movement, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
They were risking their reputations, their jobs, and possibly their lives. Then it says they continued meeting in the temple daily. Think about it. Acts 2:46. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They didn't run from scrutiny. They lived out their faith openly in the most visible religious place in the city. If the resurrection claim was false, this would have invited instant confrontation and debunking by the temple authorities. Even the priests and the Pharisees began to believe. I mean, think about that. Acts 6:7 says a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. It's remarkable.
Mm-hmm.
The same religious system that crucified Jesus saw its own leaders converting to his way. These weren't gullible outsiders. These were educated insiders. They were convinced by something real. And they could have easily refuted the message. The people in Jerusalem had access to the facts. They had the location of the tomb. They had the testimony of the guards. The disciples were known in their claims, but instead of discrediting the movement, they joined the movement in large numbers. The best explanation for their response is that the resurrection really happened and they knew it. I'm gonna have to stop there.
We're going to have to stop there. Well, thank you so much, Pastor Nick. Again, anyone who's interested, you can go to NewYorkApologetics.com. There's a lot of resources there. You can reach out to Pastor Nick if you want to get some information. If you have yourself the desire to learn more about apologetics, you can go there. He has a great training program for those who so desire. So those on live stream, thank you so much. We'll be back next week, next Wednesday, 7:30, and we will begin our study on the Trinity. So next week, we're going to begin our study on the Trinity. Once we're done with the Trinity, we're going to go into the book of Hebrews. Once we finish the book of Hebrews, we will go back to the book of Acts. So our Bible study is kind of lined out for the next year and a half. So just so everyone is aware of that, please like, share, invite a friend. If you have any prayer requests, those on live stream, you can put it in the chat underneath, and we will get back to you. And we have some great news coming up for July. The website will be launching. The Redirect podcasts will be launching, along with a lot of other great things going on here at Bethesda. So we're grateful. Pastor Nick, thank you so much. Pastor Deb, thank you for coming and being with him. Those on live stream, we'll see you next week, 7:30. Those on Zoom, just wait right here.